Ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha, and while it doesn't happen very often, sometimes I do like to review and respond directly, or at least provide my own thoughts surrounding some of the topics discussed on news media outlets. And I felt this was a very relevant topic to cover, especially given the state of Star Wars Jedi Survivor and Arcane's Redfall, especially on PC. And yes, I have spent some time personally with Jedi Survivor on PC, and I have very much encountered a great many of the issues on PC that we have all seen floating around online. However, a great many people are irritated, or in many cases also not surprised, that a large number of websites and scores on Metacritic are exorbitantly high, with many 9s, 9.5s, and even perfect 10s. Now, Paul Tassi over at Forbes is one of the few legacy media writers that I didn't actually hold in some form of contempt. In fact, he's previously garnered a measure of respect from me over some of his articles, at least until now. The other day, Paul Tassi published an article that asked a very important question that, at face value, sounds incredibly simple. But while I will be disagreeing rather strongly with some of his conclusions and decisions, I do at least agree with him that the subject is not as simple as it may seem at face value. And that question is specified quite well by the article's title, Should Critics Include or Ignore Bugs in Reviews of Games Like Jedi Survivor? Now, I will of course link the article down in the pinned comment below. Naturally, the correct answer to that question would be yes, which I stated a very similar stance on Twitter in response to Paul's posting, where the game should be reviewed as it currently stands. The game reviews for early access titles include game bugs, game-breaking issues, and the inclusion or lack of content as a part of the review process. While a review of an early access game is, by its very nature, subject to potential change or could down the road be potentially outright invalidated by the progress of the game's development, it is still expected that if the developers and publishers are expecting to sell their game to the public should know what they might be getting with their purchase, whether the game is, not necessarily where the game could be. And forgive me, but in the case of Star Wars Jedi Survivor, as with most AAA games, those are full product releases at launch. These are not early access titles. So for me, the question translates more into, why wouldn't you factor in such glaring problems into the review? But Paul does include a couple of rather pertinent points here. First, let's take the Metacritic scores. Now, most of those scores are from critics that had received review code on the PS5. Now, the PS5, in relation to Star Wars Jedi Survivor, while still buggy, was and is undoubtedly much less buggy than the PC port of the game, which is where we see the majority of those reviews. And in this case, I agree with what Paul is driving at, which is to say that it would be unrealistic under those circumstances for a review of the PS5 version of the game to reflect a bad PC port. However, unfortunately, PC gamers may have to rely on only critiques from sources that are specifically PC gaming in nature because of this. And as a result of the dichotomy between PC and console releases that we have seen over the past many years in regards to AAA titles, that is an issue in and of itself, which I feel games critics should already have begun to include as a part of their review process, but very few actually do, which is to state which platform the review is based off. A simple, single sentence would be of immense value to their readers or listeners and would help to clarify the picture for gamers attempting to find relevant information on the game they might be interested in. And even if the review is conducted for another platform, the viewer or reader would still be able to garner some key points, but they may need to go elsewhere for additional information on their preferred platform of choice. The critics themselves might push back against that, but it is a very minor addition that, yes, may decrease traffic if their review is based on another platform, where a gamer may be looking for a critique on a different platform, but it would show a bit more honesty, or at least clarity and dedication to their viewers or readers. Also, in the article, Paul says, "This is a damned if you do or don't situation for critics. The most famous example I can remember of this is when IGN's Dan Stapleton hit a game-breaking bug in Prey. Even working with the developers, he couldn't fix it and ultimately decided to give the game a 4 out of 10. Later, after playing a fixed copy, he updated the score to an 8 out of 10, but the 4 had already been fed into Metacritic to much controversy and he got yelled at a whole bunch. The gut reaction from players, I think, is, if the game is buggy and performs badly, why wouldn't you include that in the review score? Yes, that is a very good gut reaction to have. But it's such a weird situation these days because reviewers are often reviewing A, before a day 0/1 patch that can fix many issues. In fact, Jedi Survivor was performing even worse on PC before that. And B, if it's instead a week or a month when things are fixed instead, your review becomes pretty irrelevant if you spend large chunks complaining about problems that no longer exist and your score ends up significantly lower because of that. So as I was reading that, a few different things stuck out to me. And the larger of them are regarding the Metacritic website itself. Now, I can certainly understand a writer or YouTuber wanting their critique not to be rendered irrelevant in a few weeks to a month's time. They'll invariably end up getting pissed off fans for giving a low score to a game that has since been fixed. Also, I can understand not wanting to lose traffic for a review that is no longer relevant, but the problem here is it should be a critic's job to review what is, not what might be. This is especially prevalent in the indie gaming sphere where we see games abandoned by the droves, but it's not at all without precedent within the AAA gaming world also. Take for example Mass Effect Andromeda. While yes, the game was getting panned for its terrible story with enough plot holes large enough to drive a semi-truck through, its flat and ultimately boring and uninteresting antagonist, as well as the majority of content surrounding the companion characters, but also its horrendously bad facial animations in particular, and of course the many bugs, graphical issues, performance issues, and you name it when the game was first launched. Of course, this is a bit of an outlier example, but it is an example of the publishers, who are Electronic Arts yet again, who made the decision to abandon the game completely and left many, if not most of those issues, unresolved. Now, I specify that as yes, it is entirely possible that a review may become outdated. But again, a critic should never count on what may be at some point within their review. That leaves a core aspect of your critique as being ultimately dishonest. So yes, you may well spend, as Paul said, large chunks complaining about problems that no longer exist, but at least that would be honest. Now, Paul continued to state where he has personally landed. The first point reads, a review score should reflect the content of a game. It's not going to deduct points from a review of a TV show because Netflix was glitching for everyone for 48 hours due to server problems. It's not a perfect analogy, but that's sometimes how it feels to be asked to cut points for technical problems that 95% of players will probably never experience if they're fixed quickly. Which, if that is what Paul chooses, then fine. At least we know where he stands. But again, his justification for this uses the word probably. 95% of the players will probably never experience if they're fixed quickly. So a non-definitive and a hopefulness. But to my mind, and feel free to disagree with me here, that is simply ignoring a fair amount of a game's critic's job in order to stretch out usefulness whilst sticking one's head in the sand. Paul continues, you can certainly mention that you encountered performance problems, but I would not spend a large portion of the review going through them. If the problems are so bad that it's hampering your enjoyment of the game, I did indeed stop playing my PC copy of Jedi Survivor because of that, I would hold off on a review. I would instead write an article about those performance problems, but I'm not going to merge my eventual scored review with that. As writers, we have to care less about hitting embargoes when the situation simply doesn't allow for that. But the industry can be punishing in that regard as everyone hunts for clicks, and publishers often think it's weird if you miss embargoes for early copies they've given you, even if you're just trying to give the game more time. Now this, I have a big problem with. Now maybe it's my naivete showing through when it comes to the games industry, or maybe it's the fact that I'm a YouTuber and not a legacy media journalist. But quite frankly, I don't give a damn. Now, to my mind, and longtime viewers of my channel already know this to be an immutable truth firmly set in my mind, is that a critic's duty is to the consumer, not to embargo dates, not to being kind or forgiving to the developers or the publishers, understanding perhaps, without malice most definitely, but if the developers are incapable of releasing a product to a credible standard, it is not the critic's job to cover for them. It is not the critic's job to simply eliminate a core aspect of a game review process and shift it to another topic or another article to allow the developers a chance to fix their crap after the customer has already made a purchase. A purchase, I might add, that may well have happened as a result of your critique of that game. To ignore such a key element as basic functionality, stability, and performance in order to give the developers a potential out is to ignore the job itself. As I said, Perhaps this is simply my own naivete combined with the freedom I have as a YouTuber, where a games journalist beholden to the company they work for may well not have the freedom such a stance requires. But if an aspect of the games industry forces critics into a position of not holding to a pro-consumer stance, then that aspect of the industry either needs to drastically change or it needs to fade into history. After all, your role as a critic is to provide information to your readers or viewers. And if you cannot do that, then quite frankly, what purpose do you serve except as a form of free advertising for these games companies and corporations? Because at that point, what information you do provide ultimately cannot be trusted. After all, if you're willing to engage in a dishonest practice such as deliberately leaving out information in the hopes of increasing the longevity of your article or video, then there's no reason to believe that another so-called compromise won't be had further down the line. A lie of omission is still a lie. And if you deliberately leave out certain elements of your critique, then you are guilty of committing a lie of omission. In addition, problems such as we have been seeing with Star Wars Jedi Survivor and Arcane Studios' Redfall are systemic within the AAA industry. They're simply magnified examples of what we have been seeing for over a decade. Partly magnified because Star Wars is a high-profile title to be sure, and Redfall because it's Arcane Studios and Bethesda. Partly also because more and more people are refusing to tolerate the release now, patch later mentality of the games industry as a whole. Video games are different from every other form of entertainment on the planet. They very much have the capacity to be the best form of entertainment on the planet. But one key, immutable element of a video game is that it utilizes player input, player control, player interface. And if there are fundamental issues with the game that impede that player input and interactivity, then it is a travesty if a critic ignores that key element of a video game for any reason. And if you're unwilling to perform that role as a games critic, Paul Tassi, then move on to another field and leave it to those of us that will. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha, and I'll see you next time.